Shalom. Oh, you hear me? Oh, good. Oh, it's loud. Hi everybody. Hi. I'm super excited to be here, so thank you so much for coming today. Today we are going to talk about how Mobix almost ruined my relationship. But before we begin, I believe this is the first time that we meet, so hi. My name is Noaa Barki. I've been a full-stack developer for almost 5 years. I'm also a tech writer and one of the leaders of GitHub Israel community, which is the largest GitHub community in the whole world, no, in the whole universe. And also I work at an amazing company called The Tree, where we help developers and DevOps engineers to prevent Kubernetes misconfigurations from ever reaching production. But today it's not about me. Today it's about Mobix. What, when, where, and of course, how it almost ruined my relationship. So it all started a year ago. My boyfriend just started to work in a new job, and one day I asked him, hey, how things are going at your new job? And he looked at me and he said, things are going awesome. But you know what? There's something that I wanted to ask you. What is Mobix? And well, first he said Mobix, so immediately I was like, what? Please, Mobix, of course. Well, Mobix is a library which provides tools for state management, but in a reactive way. And he stared at me and he said, what do you mean by reactive? And I told him, you know, reactive programming, observables, ReactJS maybe? And with very disgusted eyes, he asked me, oh no, are you talking about Angular? So before we dive into Mobix, let's talk about reactive programming. Reactive programming means automatically update of a variable when other variables have changed. Let's take, for example, a light and a switch. And as you all know, when we flip the switch, the light turns on and off, right? Right. But I want you to think about it in coding terms. One way to implement it is something like this. So whenever we flip the switch, we change the state of the light. Now, the reason why this is not reactive is because the light here is very passive. The switch modifies the state of the light, and it's not the light that is responsible for its own state. A reactive way to implement it is by using a concept from the reactive programming world called the observable. And for those of you who don't know what is observable, that's okay. You can practically think about observable as a container or collection of items. The items in the observable are being added in an async way, like events. But the real magic is the way we access those items. Because to access the items in the observable, you need to observe the observable. So whenever the observable gets changed, you will be notified about it, and you will get access to the new items. So if we go back to the light and the switch example, a reactive way to implement it would be something like this. And as you can see, I don't use any observable data structure or anything, but if you think about it, it's almost like the light listens to the state of the switch and modify itself accordingly. But after all of this, he still looked at me and he said, okay, what does it all have to do with Mobix? And he was right. It was a good question. I'll give him that. But it was a question that I had to answer with a story. The story of how Mobix was born. So, long time ago, at a company called Mendix, there was an app with many components. They had so many components that the fact that Reacts re-render a component whenever one of the props gets changed caused them a lot of unnecessary rendering and therefore very serious performance issues. The team, strong, they had no choice. They had to find another way. And they searched and searched for a long time until one day, one of their developers decided to leverage a concept from the reactive programming world. The observable. he suggested to use the props as an observable and the render function as an observer. So whenever one of the props gets changed, the render function would be notified and will re-render the component. This way, the team could have in control over when the components get re-rendered, and in theory, they can avoid unnecessary rendering. And this is exactly what they did. They wrote the code, they packed everything in a package called Mobix, and they lived happily ever after. But then he asked me a question that changed everything. If I already use React hooks, why should I use Mobix? I'm not going to lie to you, it took us a bit 5 minutes until we started to really argue about it, mainly because I started to yell, what about components? What about separating the logic from the UI? What about performance? He completely disagreed with me, and we fought about it for more than 2 hours until we basically broke up. No, I'm just kidding. No, we didn't break up. We actually still together. But that night did turn out to be a very special night. Because by the end of that night, I realized for the first time that I don't really understand Mobix. And I started a journey. I started my journey after the meaning of Mobix. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about why you should use Mobix. And the first reason to use Mobix is because Mobix is extremely fast. Why? Because observables in Mobix are plain JavaScript proxies. Let me explain. Here you see an example of item, which is an object with price and amount. But item is also an observable that I have created using Mobix. Now, under the hood, when we create observables in Mobix, what Mobix does is that it creates a new JavaScript proxy, which means it wraps the object with a getter at a set function. This way, Mobix can know when we access the observable, i.e., we call its getter function, and when we change the observable, we call its setter function. But it's not only that. Under the hood, Mobix keeps a dependency tree of all the observables that we create. So for instance, when I created item, Mobix added a new entry in the dependency tree for item and initiated it with an empty set of observers. Okay, let's play. Let's add total, which will observe item and will return the product of item price and item amount. Now, what will happen here under the hood is that when we will call total, total will call the getter function of item and will become an observer of item. Okay. But the important thing that I want you to pay attention to is the fact that if total will never be executed, total will not become an observer, because otherwise, total will not call the getter function of item and will not become an observer. The fact that observables in Mobix are plain JavaScript proxies means that Mobix create observers at runtime, which means that Mobix keep the minimal set of observers at any time. And having the minimal set of observers means having the minimal times of re-renders. Wait, what? Let me explain. But for this, we need to dig deeper. We need to talk about what really happens when we set an observable. So here you see 4 observables. You see observable A, B, C, and D. Observable B watches A, C watches B, and D also watches B. Now, let's say that we set A to a new value, 3. Then, immediately, A will send a stale notification to all its observers. In this case, observable B. B, in response, will send a stale notification to all its observers, C and D, and the same goes to C and D. Cool. Then, A will store the value and will send 2 kinds of messages. The first would be ready message, which means I'm not going to change anymore. I'm not dependent on any other observables. I'm ready, I'm done. The second message would be whether A had actually changed its value or not. B, in response, will decide whether it is going to recompute And of course, we'll send also a ready message and whether it is actually changed or not. But I know what you're thinking right now. Here in Israel, we have a saying. It's called, let's talk tachles. So let me show you the real reason why Mobix is so fast. And here you see an example of a very simple React component. I have an input, and I also use the use state by React hooks. The handler, the onChange handler, doesn't really do anything. It simply calls the underscore set type. It doesn't really do anything. The important thing that I want you to pay attention to is the fact that the actual value of the props of the input is hard-coded. So it doesn't matter what I'm going to type or how many times I'm going to type, the input will always be the same, right? Right? Right. So let me ask you something. When I will type something, when I will basically call the handle on change, do you think the component should be re-rendered again? Who thinks the component should be re-rendered again? Okay. This is how many times the component got re-rendered when I use React hooks. This is how many times the component got re-rendered when I use Mobix. The reason why is simple. It's because when I used Mobix, I made the component reactive, and I did that using the observer. And the observer, as you can see, it looks like it doesn't really do anything. It accepts a render function of a component and returns a JSX element. But under the hood, the observer uses the props as an observable and the render function as an observer. So whenever one of the props gets changed, the render function is notified and re-renders the component. But now you understand what are observables in Mobix, and you know what really happens when we will change the props. So basically, it all comes down to this. Making React component reactive by Mobix allows us two main things. The first, to re-render the component only if the value of the props had actually changed. And the second one is to observe only the props that we use. So for instance, if I have some components and the props of some component contains foo and bar, but I only use bar, it doesn't matter how many times foo is going to change or what I'm going to change foo into, some components should not be re-rendered. And this is something that Mobix allows us to do. So as you can see, Mobix is a very performant library. But to be honest, I don't think the main reason to use Mobix is performance. I think the main reason to use Mobix is because Mobix allows you to decouple the logic from the UI. Reason why is because Mobix leverages reactive programming. And in reactive programming, it's all about the data. Reactive programming is basically event-driven development, but you always have one event and one handler. The event will always be, hey, I changed some data. And the handler will always be, yeah, okay, let's change some more data. It's always about the data. And now this is very exciting, because now we are going to fulfill one of my dreams, to have an ice cream shop. And I want to call it Barkelato. I don't know if you get it. It's a combination of my last name and gelato. It's hilarious. Anyway, remember that I said that Mobix allows us to decouple the logic from the UI and everything? Good. What would you say if we are going to create an entire application, and we're going to use the entire application, but we are not going to click on any one of the UI buttons? We're going to use it straight from our console. That far, I'm willing to take the UI and logic separation. If not, I promise, I'll get your money back. Okay. Let's start. What do we want in our ice cream shop? We want to display flavors to our customers. We want to have a shopping cart because we want our customers to place orders. We want a payment system because we love money. And last but not least, we want to have things that I like to call business logic and validation, for things like disabling the user from placing orders with flavors that are out of stock. Let's begin, starting with flavors. We basically want to fetch the flavors from the server and display them on the screen. So what I did is that I created a shop store, a class, which will also be our main store in the entire app. I added a flavors array, which is also an observable. and a private method for fetching the flavors and setting the resolved flavors inside the observable. Do you see this little guy? The running action is called an action. And actions in Mobix is the way to update observable. We need actions because they work in a transaction mode, which basically means that Mobix batches all the observables update that were executed inside the action and notify the observers only when the action is done. So for instance, if we have observable bar and we set observable bar to true and then we set it to false inside an action, whoever observes bar will be notified only once when the action is done. And actions are very cool because of two reasons. The first is that they guarantees that Mobix will never observe stale observables. And the second reason is because they allow, I always forget that I have that slide, is that they allow Mobix to run everything in a synchronized way, which makes debugging and stack tracing for us much more easier. So we love actions. And of course, I connected everything to the UI, so I created a component. I made the component reactive by using the observer by Mobix, which I showed you before. And let's see that it works. Okay, so this is our application, and as you can see, I fetch the flavors from the server and display them on the screen. So far, so good. Amazing. So we've done with flavors. Let's move forward to the shopping cart. We want to allow our customers to place orders, potentially with multiple dishes. So for that, what I did is that I created a new class called shopping cart with orders array, which is also an observable, and two methods for adding item and removing item, which create new orders and remove orders from the shopping cart. The main thing that I want you to take from this is not the implementation. It's the reactive mindset, that the shopping cart is the one that is responsible for orders, not the shop store. However, we do want to be able to pick a flavor and add that flavor to the shopping cart as an order. And the flavors are inside the shop store. So what I did is that I added the shopping cart to the shop store with two methods for adding a flavor and removing a flavor from the shopping cart. And let's see that it works. And I promised you console, so let's hook to our store. And as you can see, this is our store, our shop store. And let's add a flavor. Let's add cream. And as you can see, the data is automatically updated. Cool. So we've done with the shopping cart. Let's move forward to the money part, to the payment part. For payment, we want to make sure that our customers can pay us. So for that, what I did, I created a new method inside the shopping cart, pay, which basically accepts a payment, and increases subtotal, which is new observable. And this is the shopping cart. Now, we allow our customers to pay us, so we probably want to show them how much they need to pay us. So for that, what I did is that I added total, which is a property on the shopping cart. Total basically calls reduce on orders, calculates the total price, and subtracts the subtotal. I also decorated total with a computed value, which made total with a computed decorator, which made total a computed value. Computed values in Mobix are basically functions that watch observable and return data. So, for instance, total, it called the getter function, it got the getter function of orders, therefore it became an observer of orders. And the special thing about computed values is that they are very optimized. Computed values are memoized, and they will never be invoked unless they have at least one observer, which is awesome. Okay, so I added total, and let's see. Now we need to pay 8 shekels. So let's pay shopping cart. Yes, pay. As you can see here, maybe you missed it, the data is automatically updated. And last but not least, we want to make sure that our customers will never place orders with flavors that are out of stock. So for that, what I did is that I created a new class called flavor, which have name, price. I also added an amount left. I used this kind of implementation because I wanted to increase and decrease amount left inside the shopping cart this way. If you don't like it, it's up to you. You can change amount left to a public observable and use an action instead. Totally up to you. I also added a computed value, is out of stock, which is supposed to observe amount left and point whether the flavor is out of stock. I connected everything to the UI, which is supposed to show me the flavor as disabled when the flavor is out of stock. So let's see. Add flavor cream. One more time, the flavor is now disabled, and you know what? If I will try to add cream one more time, I even get an error. Okay, so the good thing is that I don't owe you any money, because there are many reasons to, you know, let's talk about what just happened. What just happened is that we separated the logic from the UI to the point when we could use our entire app straight from our console. And in my opinion, there are many reasons to practice UI and logic separation, but my top 2 reasons is that first, it makes everything testable. The second reason is that it allows you to be more focused on the data flows in your application. For example, it doesn't matter if I'm picking a flavor by clicking on a button or shouting the name of the flavor towards the screen. I'm picking a flavor. And when I pick a flavor, I add that flavor to the shopping cart. This is what really matters. I forgot my clicker here, so I'll go back. Okay. And also, this is the component after everything that we've done. So you can see that one, Mobix doesn't require any boilerplate or anything. And the second is that it keeps the component very clean, very tight. And I really like it. Last thing that I wanted to talk about is called derivations. And derivations in Mobix are basically functions that watch observables, and unlike computed values, which are pure functions, derivations in Mobix produces side effects. And there are several types of derivations in Mobix. We have autorun, reaction, and when. Each one works differently, but every one of them allows us to observe observables and dispatch a function whenever the observables get changed. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to cover it, but I am willing to publish a video about it, so feel free to reach out to me after this session or later. And I highly recommend everybody here to read about it. It's very interesting. And to sum up, we talked about reactive programming. We talked about what is Mobix, why does it have to be reactive, why to use Mobix, how to use Mobix, how it works under the hood, and of course, how it almost ruined my relationship. Thank you so much.